first time Peter Barlow saw the house, it was just another abandoned property on the outskirts of town. He wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories, but something about the place made his skin crawl. The real estate listing called it a fixer-upper with character. But Peter, a man who had spent years flipping houses, had a different term for it: haunted. It wasn't the peeling paint, the sagging roof, or the overgrown yard that unsettled him. It was the way the house seemed to breathe. Standing on the sidewalk, staring at the boarded-up windows, he swore he heard something shift inside, like the slow exhale of someone trying to keep quiet. He almost walked away. Almost. But the price was too good, and Peter wasn't one to let superstition get in the way of a deal. By the time he got the keys, the house had already started working on him. The nightmares began before he even stepped inside. Dark corridors stretching on forever, voices whispering from the walls, the sound of something wet dragging across the floor. Every morning, he woke up drenched in sweat, his heart hammering, but he told himself it was just nerves. The first real sign came on his third day in the house. He had spent the afternoon gutting the kitchen, pulling down ancient cabinets and tearing up the rotted floorboards. By evening, exhausted, he sat on the porch drinking a beer, watching the sun sink behind the trees. Then he saw it. In the upstairs window, a figure, a shadow barely there just for a second. A trick of the light, he told himself. But then it moved. Peter grabbed the crowbar and stormed inside, his boots echoing in the empty halls. He checked every room, every closet, even the attic. Nothing, but the smell lingered. Damp earth, like fresh-turned soil after rain. He told himself it was just the rot in the walls. Lying in bed that night, he listened. The house was too quiet. A place like this should creak, should sigh with age. But it didn't. It held its breath, like it was waiting. The next few days, the work became harder. Not physically, he'd done worse jobs, but mentally. The house was wearing him down. He kept losing track of time. One minute he was prying up floorboards, the next he was standing in the hallway, not sure how he got there. He found his tools in places he swore he hadn't left them. His phone vanished for hours only to reappear in his pocket. And then there were the doors. They wouldn't stay shut. He'd close one, turn around, and a few minutes later it would be open again. At first, he blamed the wind. But there was no wind. No draft. Just the sound of his own breath too loud in the stillness. It got worse at night. He heard footsteps in the hall. Soft, shuffling. Sometimes a whisper just on the edge of hearing. The smell of dirt grew stronger. He started waking up with his sheets tangled around him, the taste of earth in his mouth. And then, on the seventh night, he saw her. He woke to the sound of the bedroom door creaking open. Moonlight spilled in from the hallway, casting long shadows. He barely had time to sit up before she stepped inside. A woman. Or what had once been a woman. Her skin was gray, stretched too tight over her bones. Her eyes were deep, black pits, her mouth an open wound. She moved with a jerky, unnatural grace, like a puppet with half its strings cut. Dirt clung to her fingers, to her tattered dress. She smelled of the grave. Peter couldn't move, couldn't scream. His body locked up, paralyzed by fear. She stepped closer. Her head tilted, a slow, broken motion, as if she were listening for something. Then she spoke. "You brought me back." Her voice was dust and decay. Peter felt something crack inside him. She reached out, fingers hovering just above his chest. His heart stuttered, his breath caught in his throat. And then she was gone. The next morning, he packed a bag. He didn't care about the money, about the project. He needed to leave. Now. But the house wouldn't let him. Every door was locked. Every window nailed shut. His phone had no service. The air grew heavy, pressing down on him like a weight. The walls seemed closer, the ceilings lower. And the smell of dirt was everywhere now, thick and cloying. That night, she came again. This time, she didn't just watch. Peter woke to the feeling of fingers curling around his wrist. Cold, damp, impossibly strong. He gasped, tried to pull away, but the grip tightened. And then he was falling. Not onto the floor. Not into the bed. Into the earth. He landed hard, the breath knocked out of him. He was in a pit. Walls of dirt rose around him, the roots of dead trees hanging like skeletal fingers. Above, the house loomed, distant and unreachable. And she was there, standing at the edge, staring down at him with those empty black eyes. "You opened the door," she whispered. "Now you stay." The dirt shifted beneath him. He sank. He clawed at the walls, but the soil crumbled in his hands. the weight of the earth pressed down, filling his mouth, his lungs. He tried to scream, but the dirt swallowed the sound. And the last thing he saw before the world went black was the house. Waiting. Breathing. The first time Henry Vance heard the whispers, he was 6 years old. It was late October, and the wind howled against the windows of the old Vance house in Black Hollow, a forgotten town tucked away in the Maine woods. His mother, pale and frail, had been sitting in her rocker, staring out into the darkness beyond the porch. She never turned to look at him when she spoke. "They never leave, Henry." Not really. He didn't understand then. But 20 years later, when he returned to Black Hollow to bury his mother, the whispers returned too. Henry had spent most of his adult life trying to forget the town where he grew up. Black Hollow had a way of clinging to people like a sickness, dragging them down into its quiet, decaying grip. He swore he'd never go back. But when the call came from the funeral home, his mother's voice seemed to whisper in the wind again. He had no choice. The house hadn't changed much. The porch sagged a little more, the shutters flapped against the siding in the cold October air. But inside, the weight of memory pressed against his chest like an iron hand. The floorboards groaned under his feet as he walked through the rooms, childhood ghosts lurking in every corner. Then, that first night back, the whispers began again. It started as a rustling sound in the walls, like mice scurrying just out of sight. But soon, the rustling became voices, soft, insistent. Henry told himself it was the wind through the eaves, the house settling after years of neglect. But when he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he could make out words. "Henry, you remember, don't you?" He sat up, heart hammering. The voice was familiar. Not his mother's. Something older. Something from his childhood, from the dreams that had chased him for years after he left. The next morning, he found the attic door open. He hadn't been up there in decades, not since he was a boy. The last time, he'd sworn never to return. But now, drawn by something he couldn't name, he climbed the creaking stairs. The attic smelled of dust and time. Sunlight slanted through a cracked window, illuminating old trunks and forgotten furniture. But in the far corner, something else waited. A small wooden chair, placed exactly as it had been 20 years ago. Henry's stomach twisted. He had spent countless hours in that chair as a child. His mother standing behind him, whispering into his ear, telling him stories of the house, the things that lived in the walls, the reason his father left and never came back. "They choose one of us," she had said. Always. He had thought it was just one of her delusions. Until now. That night, the whispers grew louder. They called his name. They laughed and sobbed. They scratched against the walls, growing bolder. Henry covered his ears, but the voices slithered into his mind like smoke. Then he saw the shape standing at the foot of his bed. It was small. Too small to be an adult, but its proportions were wrong. Its arms too long, its fingers curling unnaturally. The darkness clung to it, a shifting mass that made Henry's skin crawl. "It's your turn," the thing whispered. Henry bolted from the bed, stumbling back until his spine hit the wall. The thing tilted its head, studying him with hollow sockets where eyes should be. "You left, but you came back. We remember." A scream built in Henry's throat, but before he could release it, the room plunged into blackness. Henry woke on the attic floor, the morning sun cutting through the dust-filled air. His body ached, his clothes were damp with sweat. The chair sat before him, waiting. He didn't remember coming up here, but he knew the whispers had brought him. They had been waiting. For 20 years, they had waited. As he stood, something shifted behind him. A reflection in the dusty mirror leaning against the wall. He turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. His mother stood there. Only it wasn't her. The thing wearing her face smiled, its lips curling back too far, revealing jagged, rotting teeth. "You always belonged here, Henry," it rasped. "We never really let you go." The attic door slammed shut, and the whispers rose in a deafening chorus. The last thing Henry felt before the darkness took him was the cold grip of tiny fingers closing around his wrist. A month later, the town sheriff visited the old Vance house. Henry's car was still in the driveway, but no one answered the door. The house was empty, save for a single wooden chair in the attic. And if you listened closely, just beneath the howling October wind, you could hear the faintest sound of a voice whispering from the walls. "It's your turn." It started with a mirror. Just an old, dusty mirror propped against the wall of a thrift store in Westfield, Maine. Jack Sullivan wasn't looking for one, but something about it held his gaze. It was large, antique, probably late 19th century, with an ornate brass frame tarnished with age. The price tag said $30. He didn't know why he bought it, but something about the way his reflection looked back at him just a second too slow made his stomach tighten. He brushed it off as an old mirror quirk and took it home. Jack was 42, divorced. His ex-wife, Lisa, had left him for a younger man. He never blamed her. A decade of late nights and whiskey-fueled self-loathing had made him a hollow shell. The house, once filled with warmth, now smelled of dust, stale beer, and loneliness. He placed the mirror in his bedroom against the far wall opposite his bed. That night, as he lay staring at the ceiling, he had the strangest sensation that someone was watching him. The hair on his arms stood up. He rolled over, eyes landing on the mirror. His reflection was still. Too still. Jack sat up, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. The reflection followed, this time perfectly. He let out a breathy chuckle. Just tired. That's all. But sleep didn't come easy. The next few days, little things began to change. He would turn away from the mirror and swear he caught movement in the corner of his eye. His reflection would smile when he wasn't smiling. Or it would turn its head slower than he did, as if it were lagging behind. One morning, he stood in front of the mirror, shaving. He glanced away for a second, but when he looked back, the reflection was still rubbing its cheek, long after he had stopped. Jack dropped the razor, heart hammering. His breath fogged up the glass, and for a moment, he thought he saw something behind his reflection. Something dark. By the end of the week, he avoided the mirror altogether, covered it with a bedsheet. But even then, he could feel it. Like something pressing against the other side, waiting. He tried to ignore it, but the nightmares started. Dreams of standing in front of the mirror, unable to move while his reflection smirked and reached for him. Dreams where the reflection wasn't him at all, but something wearing his skin, whispering in a voice that wasn't his. "You're wasting this life, Jack. Let me take over." He woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. That Sunday, he made a decision. The mirror had to go. He dragged it down to the basement and threw a sheet over it. Out of sight, out of mind. For the first time in weeks, he slept peacefully. Until 3:07 a.m. A sound woke him. A slow, deliberate creaking. His bedroom door. Jack sat up, blood running cold. The door was open. He always kept it closed. He reached for the lamp, but before his fingers could touch the switch, he heard it. Breathing. Deep. Slow. Not his own. Jack turned his head toward the darkness. A shape stood in the doorway. Tall. Wrong. Its face obscured by the shadows. But he knew. It was him. The figure took a step forward. Jack scrambled back, his pulse a wild drumbeat in his ears. The thing in the doorway tilted its head, amused. Then it spoke. "Been waiting for this." Jack lunged for the lamp, flipping it on. The doorway was empty. His heart pounded against his ribs. He staggered out of bed, flipping every light switch he could reach. The house was empty, but the basement door was open. He knew. He didn't want to know, but he did. Jack grabbed the hammer from the kitchen drawer and made his way downstairs. The air was thick, heavy, charged like before a thunderstorm. The sheet was gone. The mirror stood there, untouched. And in the reflection, not him. A thing that looked like him, but the eyes were wrong. Too dark. Too deep. It grinned, raising a hand to the glass. Jack staggered back as his reflection pressed forward. The glass rippled like water. "No," Jack whispered. "No, no, no." The reflection pushed harder. The glass bulged outward like a bubble about to burst. Jack swung the hammer with all his strength. The mirror shattered. For a moment, silence. Then a gust of wind rushed through the basement. A howling, unnatural force. Shards of glass exploded outward, slicing his arms, his face. Jack hit the ground, covering his head. Then nothing. When he dared to look up, the mirror was gone. Nothing but an empty frame. Jack let out a breath, trembling. He was safe. The next morning, he felt lighter, as if something had been lifted from him. He showered, made coffee, even smiled at the thought of getting his life together. He caught his reflection in the kitchen window. Normal. Just him. Then he turned away, and his reflection did not. It grinned and winked. Jack dropped the coffee mug. It shattered at his feet. Behind him, the reflection raised a hand and stepped forward. It started with the tapping. At first, James Holbrook thought it was the old maple tree outside his bedroom window. The wind had picked up that night, and the branches scraped against the glass like fingernails. He was used to that sound. What he wasn't used to was the tapping, light, deliberate, rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. James turned over in bed, pulling the blanket higher. His wife, Ellen, was sound asleep beside him, her soft snores filling the room. He squeezed his eyes shut, told himself it was nothing, just his mind playing tricks. Then it came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. A chill crawled up his spine. It was coming from inside the room. James sat up, his breath shallow. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed 2:13 a.m. He scanned the darkness, searching for the source of the sound. The shadows seemed thicker than usual, pressing in around the edges of the room. Then he saw it. A figure stood in the corner by the closet. It was tall, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. The body was obscured by the darkness, but James could make out its eyes. Deep, black voids staring straight at him. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. Then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, the figure said, "Let me in." James gasped, his body finally breaking free from its paralysis. He fumbled for the lamp, knocking over a glass of water in his panic. The room flooded with light. Nothing. The corner was empty. The closet door was shut tight. Ellen stirred beside him but didn't wake. His heart hammered in his chest as he ran a trembling hand through his hair. "Just a dream," he muttered. "Just a goddamn dream." But deep down, he wasn't so sure. The next morning, James went about his routine, trying to shake off the lingering unease. He kissed Ellen goodbye, grabbed his coffee, and headed to work at the law firm. By the time he was knee-deep in contracts, the events of the night felt distant, like a half-remembered nightmare. That changed when he got home. Ellen met him at the door, her face pale. "James, something's wrong." His stomach clenched. "What do you mean?" She led him to the bedroom. The closet door, the one that had been shut tight, was wide open. Clothes lay strewn across the floor as if someone had rifled through them. But that wasn't the worst part. On the inside of the closet door, carved into the wood in jagged letters, was a message, "Let me in." James stared at it, his mouth dry. "Did you do this?" Ellen shook her head, her eyes wide. "Of course not. I thought maybe you know." His voice was hoarse. "I didn't." Silence stretched between them. Then Ellen shuddered. "James, I don't feel alone in here. Even when you're gone. It's like something's watching me." James felt it too. The oppressive weight in the air. The sensation of being observed by something just beyond the edge of sight. That night, neither of them slept. The tapping came back 3 nights later. This time, it was louder, more insistent. James sat bolt upright as the sound echoed through the room. Ellen clutched his arm, her fingers digging into his skin. The closet door, which he had locked, stood wide open. The darkness inside was impenetrable, deeper than it should have been. Then the whisper came again. "Let me in." James had heard many things in his life, pleas, threats, confessions. But nothing chilled him like those 3 words. His pulse pounded in his ears as he reached for the lamp. The second the light flickered on, the whisper stopped. The room looked normal again. But Ellen wasn't looking at the closet. She was staring at the mirror above the dresser, her face ashen. "James," she breathed, "it's in the mirror." He turned slowly, dread curdling in his stomach. At first, his reflection looked normal. But then it moved just a fraction of a second too late. And when it smiled, James did not. The thing in the mirror raised one skeletal hand and tapped the glass. Tap, tap, tap. James grabbed Ellen's hand, yanking her away from the dresser. The reflection's grin widened, stretching unnaturally. The room seemed to pulse, the walls warping as the air grew thick and heavy. The whisper came one final time, but now it was inside his head. "Let me in." Then the mirror shattered. They left the house that night. Didn't pack a bag. Didn't look back. They drove until the sun rose, and when they finally stopped at a motel on the outskirts of town, neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. James sold the house within a week. Took a loss, didn't care. They moved to an apartment in the city, far from anything resembling their old life. But sometimes late at night, James wakes to the sound of tapping. He tells himself it's nothing, but he never looks in the mirror. It started with a noise, a soft tapping, barely audible, just beneath the floorboards of Daniel Carter's childhood home. He hadn't heard it in years, not since he left for college a decade ago. Now, standing in the dust-ridden, memory-haunted house after his mother's funeral, he heard it again. Tap, Tap, tap. Daniel froze. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, mothballs, and something else. Something sour. He let out a slow breath, telling himself it was just the house settling. That's what his mother used to say whenever he heard the sound as a child. Except the house was done settling. It had been standing for over 100 years. And the noise had a rhythm, deliberate and insistent, like fingers tapping against wood. The house was his now. That was what the lawyer told him. A relic he neither wanted nor needed, filled with faded photographs and furniture wrapped in white sheets like ghostly sentinels. He wandered through the rooms, every creak of the floorboards sending a shiver up his spine. His mother had lived here alone since his father disappeared when Daniel was 9. She never moved, never redecorated, as if waiting for something or someone. He had been a nervous child, prone to nightmares. His mother would scold him when he talked about the tapping. "Don't be foolish, Danny," she'd say. "It's just the house. Houses make noises." But houses didn't whisper. Lying in his old bed that first night, he heard it again. Not just the tapping, but something else. Something beneath it, almost like a voice. A whispering just beyond the edge of comprehension. He told himself it was the wind, the old pipes, the echoes of childhood fears clawing back into his mind. Then he felt it. A vibration, faint but unmistakable, right beneath his bed. A tremor in the wood, like something was moving underneath the floorboards. Morning came, and Daniel's exhaustion was a weight on his shoulders. He spent the day sorting through his mother's belongings, trying to make sense of a life she never fully shared with him. He found old letters, faded and brittle, written in a language he didn't understand. The more he searched, the more he realized how little he had truly known about her. That night, he brought a flashlight to bed. He wasn't sure why, maybe to comfort himself, maybe to prove something. He lay awake, waiting. The tapping started around 2 a.m. Tap, tap, tap. He held his breath, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The sound wasn't coming from the walls. It wasn't even coming from beneath the floorboards. It was inside them. With a slow, shaking hand, he swung his legs off the bed and knelt. He pressed his ear to the floor. The whispering was clearer now, a faint, rasping voice just below the surface. His skin prickled as he reached out and ran his fingers along the wood. A breath of air, warm, wet, exhaled through the crack between the boards. Daniel jerked back, heart hammering. He scrambled for his phone, but there was no signal. The tapping grew louder, faster. The whispering turned into something guttural, something hungry. And then the boards buckled. A hand shot through the wood, thin, gray, fingers too long, too sharp. It clawed at the air, reaching for him. Daniel scrambled backward, his scream lodged in his throat. Another hand emerged, followed by the glint of something dark and wet peering through the splintered gap. His mother's voice rang in his head, a memory from childhood. "Never, ever lift the floorboards, Danny. If you do, you'll let it out." A crackling, hollow voice rasped from beneath the floor. Daniel. His name. It knew his name. He ran. Down the stairs, through the hallway, his mother's framed photographs flashing past like watching his own life blink away. The walls groaned, the house breathing around him. The front door wouldn't budge. He fumbled with the locks, fingers slick with sweat, as the tapping grew louder, faster. Then silence. He turned, chest heaving. The thing stood at the top of the stairs. It was wrong, twisted, the shape of a man, but stretched too thin, its eyes nothing but deep, black voids. It smiled, lips splitting too wide, and took a step forward. Its bare feet made no sound against the wood. "Been waiting," it whispered. "So long." Daniel's mind fractured. He did the only thing he could. He ran into the kitchen, grabbing the first thing his shaking hands could find. A rusted fire poker. He turned as the thing moved closer, slow and deliberate, savoring the moment. He swung. The metal connected with its head. But the thing didn't flinch. It just grinned wider. "You brought me back," it crooned. "You came home." Daniel screamed, swinging again, and this time the thing staggered. It let out a sound, something between a laugh and a moan of pleasure. It wanted this. It wanted him to fight. It lunged. The next morning, the house was quiet, peaceful. The dust had settled. Daniel was gone. A single mark was left in the center of the wooden floor. A long, thin crack, as though something had clawed its way back beneath the boards. The house waited, and then tap, tap, tap.